I want to sort of situate this paper in the project that I'm involved in. I've been writing about secularism. I suppose that's all I've been writing about for about the past 10 years or so. And so the term secularism is very near and dear to my heart. And I'm very animated by conceptual history. So I've written a bit about the conceptual history of the term secularism. And I'm sort of, as part of that work on the interwar period, that I was trying to suggest that the way that someone like Talal Asad approaches secularism, basically as state secularism, separation, state management of religion, that genealogy, as he calls it, of secularism is a bit skewed because he just leaves out all of the sort of contention over religion and radical secularism in the 20th century. And so the part of my thinking about the interwar culture war is also a critique of that understanding of secularism, which is very prevalent still, I think, in discussions in critical theory, political science, and international relations. So there's that interest in secularism, and then my book project that I want to start after I finish the one I'm on now is going to be a conceptual history of the term worldview, Weltanschauung, Weltbeschouwing, or Lebensbeschouwing.
Wereldbeschouwing exists too.
Weltanschauung, yes.
Lebensanschauung.
Yeah, so, and what I want to do is I think that this is a really crucial term, not just for contemporary culture wars in the United States, but really throughout Western Europe, obviously Germany in particular, since the mid-19th century. And I want to situate worldview within various apologetic struggles between secularists and Christians, between anti-Semites and the leftists, and so on. And I want to work through sort of strands of the way in which worldview is articulated in these various struggles. And recently I've turned from the 19th century to the 20th century, and I became very interested in a group of intellectuals, sociologists associated with the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which was an organization launched in the 1948 to 50 period, and it was an organization of liberal anti-communists from Western Europe, from the United States, who were making an effort to offer an alternative to the attractions of communism and Marxism, and trying to neutralize, particularly the aim was to neutralize communist efforts in Western Europe. And they set up many journals, Der Monat, Proof, etc., all funded then by the US government, but through the CIA and the Ford Foundation, I think. So it's really it's a very well-funded, important intellectual political endeavor in the Cold War. And they're known, of course, for the end of ideology debate. That thesis by Daniel Bell and others was aired at congresses of this association in Europe in particular. So from 56 to 60, they were circulating this idea of the end of ideologies. And I thought to myself, I believe that there is a part of their intellectual effort to roll back communism appears in a criticism of worldview. And so, I may be forcing it a bit too hard because my assumption is that it's there in the end of ideology debate. So I've been looking for it, and of course I find it. You find it Leitmon talking about the addiction to worldviews as the German subtitle of his book, The Opium of the Intellectuals. And I find statements in many of all of these key thinkers about Weltanschauung. And in particular, what I find interesting is that their criticism of ideology has little to do with ideology as understood in a Marxist framework, even though they all have Marxist backgrounds. So they're all very well trained in Marxism, but when it comes to Daniel Bell's definition, I put it in the paper, when it comes to his definition of what ideology is, in the end he says it's secular religion, right? And if you understand the way that worldview is constructed since the 19th century, the notion that it is a counterpart or a model of kind of secularized worldview. That's the way worldview. That's the difference between worldview and political philosophy for Marxists. So So I thought that was very interesting. And then my question that I kind of posed in this paper was, what does this work, right? This critique of worldview and the rejection of worldview as a valid philosophical mode. And how does that relate to the 60s dialogue of Marxism and religion? And I kind of came up with a thesis then that this was somehow part of the conditions of possibility of this dialogue even taking place. So that for many of the liberals in the Cold War, if it was possible to separate worldview from left-wing thought, for example, that might make it possible for anti-communists even to enter into a dialogue with Marxists. Okay, that was something of my assumption, and then that's sort of one half of the worldview question. The other interesting thing that is kind of an add-on here, which I've explored a bit more elsewhere, is the fact that in the tradition of neo-Calvinism, which reaches the United States via Abraham Kuyper, there's a whole embrace of worldview by Christian conservatives and evangelicals and so on. And they effectively make the idea of worldview really into their way of combating modernity or of the secular and so on. And so it's very, particularly in the American tradition, I think in the Dutch case, it kind of moves in another direction. So the Dutch still use levensbeschouwing, but it's not the same as when American evangelicals use worldview. So when American evangelicals use worldview, they're really talking about maintaining this idea of the antithesis in modern thought and saying effectively, there's two ways of reading the Bible. There's the true believers, and then there's the secular view. And they're not reading the same Bible because they have different worldviews, different presuppositions. So this mode of approaching apologetics, which is embraced by American evangelicals, makes worldview this absolutely central term for evangelical thought. And to this day, I put in the paper, if you put in Amazon search worldview, you'll come up with over 1,000 titles. I suppose many of them are redundant titles, but anyway, you come up with over 1,000 titles, and I'm certain that over half of them are American evangelicals writing in a positive sense about worldview and what a fantastic thing it is to have a Christian worldview. So what happens in the 60s is you have that with that kind of, that liberal Protestants in the transatlantic ecumenical sphere, I think, start moving away from this notion of the antithesis, and they start moving away from this notion of two worldviews that are clashing. But American evangelicals don't, and they maintain that distinction, and they maintain a positive identification with the term worldview. And so I just would map that onto this interesting split that I think goes on in anti-communism and religion in the 60s, which is liberals move away from anti-communism, and it is increasingly conservative Protestants take up the mantle of anti-communist Christian leadership. And there's an interesting essay by this Swiss historian, Adrian, I forget his last name, Herney, or I think, where he looks at a little group called Le Cercle, which is an association started by Adenauer and Schumann as a kind of Franco-German meeting place, sort of informal meeting that starts in, I believe, the early 50s and continues perhaps even to today. And it started out very much as a Catholic anti-communist organization, and in the 70s, increasingly they became dominated by Americans, British, and South Africans, white South Africans. So it became essentially a pro-apartheid conservative organization that was, trying to maintain the connection somewhat between Christianity and the Cold War. But it became dominated by these Protestants, and with connections, for instance, to the Reagan White House. Okay, so where does this leave us? So the starting point of this, as I wrote, was trying to think about ways of approaching these big discursive shifts that are happening between the 50s and the 60s, and this was my focusing on a kind of more narrow history of a sequence of events and trying to compare semantic fields and how they're moving. And I tried to overlap secularism and worldview. And my claim was that the important thing is that with all these critiques that are happening, there's a separation of secularism and worldview going on in the 50s. So that's my 2 bits.